I paid for my wife's sister's entire wedding and got seated at the back. Not metaphorically. Not one of those "we didn't save you a place at the main table" slights people later try to smooth over with bad apologies and better champagne. I mean the actual back. Table 29. Half hidden behind a white floral column thick enough to block the dance floor. 8 feet from the catering station, close enough to hear the waiter's call for more bass and not close enough to hear the vows without the echo from the side speakers. My name wasn't printed in the family section of the program. My place card had been written by hand, which meant it had been added after the real seating chart was finalized. I know because I paid for the calligrapher too. The ballroom was the Grand Conservatory at Halcyon House in Charleston, one of those restored 19th-century properties where wealth performs humility by wrapping itself in magnolia branches and candlelight. The glass roof carried the last blue of the evening sky. A string quartet had been replaced by a 12-piece swing band as the cocktail hour bled into dinner. White roses climbed every column. The custom bar menu used watercolor sketches of the estate's fountain. There were imported linens from Florence, oysters from Prince Edward Island, and a cake flown in from New York because my sister-in-law Amelia decided 6 weeks before the ceremony that local fondant work looked provincial. I paid for all of it. Every orchid. Every chair. Every crystal flute. Every overruled invoice and emergency floral rush and custom shuttle route and weatherproof clear-top tent they insisted on installing over the South Lawn as if South Carolina had personally promised not to rain for old money. $311,482.16. That was the final number as of noon on the wedding day, when my office approved the last-minute extension for the live jazz trio Amelia wanted at the rehearsal dinner because the string quartet suddenly felt too bridal and not enough cinematic. My wife, Genevieve Beaumont Hayes, had asked me to keep my role quiet. Not because she was ashamed, she said. Because her father would be. That was how it started. Or at least that was the explanation offered to me when I first learned, 4 months before the ceremony, that the Beaumont family could no longer cover the wedding they had spent a year bragging about. Henry Beaumont had overextended himself in a land syndication deal outside Savannah and spent the next 3 weeks pretending his liquidity problem was a temporary inconvenience instead of what it really was, a wall. His wife, Celeste, called it an unfortunate timing issue. Genevieve called it delicate. Amelia called it humiliating and then cried in our kitchen for 40 minutes while my wife rubbed her shoulders and looked at me with the expression she used when she wanted something expensive to feel inevitable. It's not forever, Genevieve had said that night. Just float it quietly. Dad will repay you when the assets clear. Amelia cannot have her wedding collapse over a short-term cash bottleneck. A bottleneck. That's how rich families describe a $250,000 hole when they still believe language is collateral. I should tell you now that I did not pay for the wedding because I was spineless. I paid because I loved my wife. And because once upon a time I believed love was partly the art of absorbing impact before it reached the people attached to you. That belief cost me a lot more than the wedding. But we'll get there. At 6:42 p.m., with the first course being plated and the room filling with the low-polished laughter of people who have never carried folding chairs into a rented hall themselves, my mother-in-law walked by my table without stopping. She was in pale silver silk, diamonds like cold rain at her ears. And the kind of expression women like Celeste Beaumont wear when they think graciousness is something that can be outsourced to posture. She glanced at my place card. Not at me. Then she said, to no one and therefore to me, I do wish the planner had been less literal about late seating revisions. Late seating revisions. Like I had wandered in from valet and asked if there was room for one more near the kitchen. I looked up from my untouched bourbon. I imagined she was following instructions, I said. Celeste's smile never quite formed. It's such a full room, Daniel. These things get complicated. Daniel. My name is Caleb. We've been family for 9 years. She knew my name. She simply didn't know enough shame to use it correctly when hierarchy became inconvenient. Caleb, I said. Of course, she replied, already moving on. Across the room, my wife saw it happen and did nothing. That part mattered more than the name. Genevieve stood near the sweetheart table with 2 bridesmaids and a wedding planner, one hand pressed lightly to the small of Amelia's back while photographers circled like expensive gnats. She saw her mother pause at my table. Saw me answer. Saw Celeste walk away. And then she turned back toward the cameras. No correction. No check-in. Not even the courtesy of one apologetic look. That's when I began to understand the real function of the back table. It wasn't overflow. It was erasure with linens. The groom's family had begun arriving from Miami that afternoon. The Ramirezes were warm, loud, direct, and insufficiently impressed by the Beaumont's sacred rituals of inherited understatement. Amelia had spent half the engagement trying to teach Daniel Ramirez's mother how to pronounce the venue's name the way locals did, as if vowels carried bloodline. Henry and Celeste, for their part, had spent the same months praising Daniel's discipline, legal mind, and excellent family values in tones that made it clear they considered his first-generation Cuban background both charming and correctable. Daniel himself was different. He was 34, a corporate attorney in Miami with the irritatingly steady gaze of a man who notices more than polite people expect. Broad-shouldered, composed, not slick. The kind of person who says less because he's actually listening, not because he's rehearsing his next sentence in better lighting. I liked him the 3 times we'd met before the wedding, which should have warned me the Beaumonts eventually wouldn't. He had once asked me a question no one else in Genevieve's family had ever asked. He asked what I built. Not how big the company was. Not whether I planned to exit. Not whether my logistics firm was one of those unsexy but necessary businesses wealthy people suddenly discover they respect once they learn the margins. He asked what I built. So I told him. Hayes Regional Logistics started with 1 leased yard outside Louisville, 3 refrigerated trucks, and contracts nobody glamorous wanted because spoiled inventory is invisible until it's catastrophic. We handled cold chain recovery, emergency rerouting, pharma storage overflow, and eventually municipal resilience distribution when hurricanes or grid failures turned supply chains into moral tests. My father drove long-haul poultry routes for 27 years. My mother processed insurance claims at a county hospital and could spot billing fraud faster than half the auditors I later hired. I grew up learning that systems only look boring to people who have never had one fail over their heads. By 40, I had 7 regional hubs, federal emergency contracts, a private fleet, and enough liquidity that covering my in-laws' fantasy wedding did not threaten my life. It only threatened my dignity. Different line item. As servers moved around me with trays of champagne and goat cheese tartlets I wasn't supposed to notice I hadn't been offered, I checked my phone. 2 messages from my CFO, Nina Park. Final vendor clearances complete. Ledger closed unless Beaumont adds surprise after-party fireworks. Second message, 2 minutes later. Also, for the record, please tell me someone in that family at least put you near the front. I looked up at the back of a floral column and typed back 1 sentence. Near the service door. Poetry lives. Nina responded with a single word. Unbelievable. No. What happened next was believable. That's the tragedy of it. Nothing the Beaumonts did that night emerged from nowhere. Humiliation that polished has usually been in committee for years. I took a slow sip of bourbon and looked across the ballroom at the head table where my wife belonged naturally and I, apparently, did not. Genevieve in champagne satin. Amelia glowing in structured lace. Henry Beaumont already wearing the relaxed smile of a man whose creditors had, for one evening, been hidden by flowers. Beside the sweetheart table stood the framed welcome sign with curling gold script. The Beaumonts and Ramirezes request the honor of your presence. No mention of hosts. No mention of gratitude. And certainly no mention of the man whose wire transfers had turned panic into peonies. You can learn almost everything about a family from how they handle private dependents in public settings. Some families become grateful. Some become careful. The Beaumonts became offended by the evidence. I knew that before the salad course. I knew it before Henry finally approached my table with 2 fingers hooked casually in his jacket pocket, performing the loose-limbed confidence of a man who believed rooms still bent around his surname. He stopped beside my chair and looked not at the table number, not at the pillar, not at the service corridor behind me, but at the ballroom as a whole. As if the entire event were his own craftsmanship. "Magnificent evening," he said. "Expensive one," I replied. He gave a soft chuckle. "Your sense of humor has always been a little Midwestern in moments of pressure." I let that sit. Pressure. Interesting word from a man whose office had called mine 4 times in the prior week asking whether the final venue installment had definitely cleared and whether I might also quietly take care of Amelia's rehearsal brunch invoices because a temporary account hold had complicated things. "I wanted a word," Henry said. "I'm listening." He lowered his voice. "I know the seating isn't ideal. The planner had to make last-minute adjustments for donor families and Daniel's senior partners. Optics, you understand. Amelia's future matters tonight." There it was. Optics. The national anthem of people who would rather insult you than be seen needing you. I turned in my chair and looked up at him properly. "I understand perfectly," I said. "What I don't understand is why everyone in this room seems so comfortable pretending the man who paid for the evening is the one whose optics need managing." Henry's expression did not change much. Men like him practice emotional minimalism as if it were statesmanship. But a pulse moved in his jaw. "Let's not be vulgar," he said. "By discussing invoices? By discussing money at a wedding?" I glanced around the conservatory. The imported candles. The 12-piece band. The custom hand-painted dance floor insert with Amelia's new monogram. The absurd fountain wall someone had installed just for cocktail hour photographs. Then I looked back at him. "Henry," I said, "money is the wedding." That was when I saw the groom across the room. Daniel Ramirez had just come in from the portrait garden with his best man and 2 cousins. He was adjusting his cuff links, smiling at something somebody said, all polished charm and ceremony. Then his eyes landed on me. He frowned. Not because he didn't recognize me. Because he did. And in the next 30 seconds, while Henry Beaumont was still standing over me like proximity itself could restore hierarchy, the groom started walking straight toward the back table. "Mr. Hayes," he said when he reached me, loud enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. "Why are you sitting back here?" Henry went very still. I looked from Daniel to my father-in-law and back again. And for the first time that evening, I felt the room begin to turn. To understand why that question hit the room like dropped glass, you need to understand the Beaumonts. And to understand the Beaumonts, you need to understand the particular violence of being appreciated privately by people who find you embarrassing in daylight. I met Genevieve Beaumont at a charity breakfast in Atlanta where nobody under 60 actually wanted to be, which is usually the best place to meet the kind of woman who has spent her life learning how to smile inside obligation. I was 32. She was 29. The event was for regional arts education, heavy on board members, donor families, and the sort of polished civic vanity that likes to call itself stewardship. Hayes Regional had just finished emergency distribution support after a severe storm season in coastal Georgia, and one of the sponsoring banks had invited me because I had apparently become the sort of entrepreneur old institutions parade around when they want to seem grounded in reality without having to touch much of it. Genevieve was seated 2 chairs away from me. Navy dress. Pearl earrings. Hair twisted up in a way that looked accidental if you had never watched wealthy women spend real money achieving effortlessness. She asked me whether I had actually driven trucks when I first started the company. I told her yes. She asked whether I missed it. I told her sometimes. The road had a way of stripping vanity down to weather and fuel costs. She laughed at that. Not the dry social laugh she'd been using on the board members. A real one. Warm, surprised, almost conspiratorial. "You're not what I expected," she said. That's usually because expectations are lazy, I replied. She smiled over her coffee cup in a way that should have warned me. Genevieve's gift was not deception exactly. She was not theatrical enough for outright manipulation in the cheap sense. Her talent was selective authenticity. She gave you the parts of herself that made your trust feel discerning. She could sound candid while still remaining strategically unowned. At the time, though, all I heard was relief. Relief that someone from a room full of lacquered surnames was talking to me like a person, not a useful case study in upward mobility. We dated long distance for 11 months. Atlanta, Charleston, Louisville, occasional weekends in New York when her consulting work for arts foundations took her north and mine took me east. She said she loved that I built things no one glamorous noticed until they failed. She said it made me real. She said men in her world were too polished, too inherited, too worried about seeming inevitable. With me, she said, she felt steadiness instead of performance. That sentence carried me farther than it should have. I came from people who said what they meant with their backs and paychecks. My father, Robert Hayes, drove long-haul refrigerated freight across 6 states and knew 300 different ways weather could turn a schedule into fiction. My mother, Janine, spent 29 years in hospital insurance processing and had a genius for spotting who was lying about numbers before they finished their first explanation. We were not poor in the dramatic storybook sense. We had food, rules, and enough laughter that hard years never became identity. But we were never cushioned. Every good month was temporary until proven otherwise. I learned early that dignity and luxury are not the same thing. That lesson made me rich. It also made me vulnerable to Genevieve. Because when someone from a world built on polish looks at a man from a world built on function and says I see you, he hears more than a compliment. He hears release. The Beaumont family entered slowly. Celeste first, with the kind of southern graciousness that functions like a gloved hand over a lock. She told me over lunch once that I had excellent manners for someone who clearly had to acquire them professionally, which is an insult so polished it spends years passing for wit. Henry arrived next, private equity, timber money, family foundations, advisory boards, every expensive room in Charleston and Palm Beach already measured and filed inside him. He wasn't loud. Men like Henry never are. They prefer understatement because it lets contempt dress up as discernment. The first time he visited one of my Louisville distribution hubs, he stood in the loading bay doorway watching forklift traffic move around pallets of vaccine storage units and said, "Fascinating scale for such a utilitarian business." Utilitarian. I said, most profitable things are, until they get photographed. He smiled like a man noting insolence in a junior analyst. Amelia, Genevieve's younger sister, was 24 when I met her. Beautiful in the curated way some women are beautiful because entire family ecosystems have been constructed around never letting them experience a badly lit angle. She had a trust fund, a graduate degree in nothing urgent, and the kind of emotional metabolism that translated inconvenience into injury within minutes. At first she liked me because I brought Genevieve flowers that were not sourced by a florist with opinions. Later she liked me because I became useful. That's another thing you learn about certain families. Affection and utility share a border they rarely bother to mark. Genevieve and I married 2 years later at a chapel outside Charleston where the Beaumonts very generously paid for the parts visible in photographs and I quietly covered the parts not worth narrating. Security overruns. Vendor transport. Last-minute climate control inside the tent when the September heat turned bridal makeup into engineering. I did not resent it then. In fact I found the asymmetry almost charming. That was love at its dumbest and best, the willingness to turn imbalance into intimacy because you believe the scale will correct naturally over time. For a while, our marriage was good. Not perfect. Not movie good. Better than that sometimes. We bought a house in Charlotte because it split my travel between the Louisville hub and our newer coastal contracts, and because Genevieve insisted she wanted a life built around something more modern than Charleston's museum-quality suffocation. She started a boutique cultural strategy consultancy advising museums, private donors, and arts nonprofits on programming and donor messaging. I invested quietly in her first 2 hires, covered the office lease when an anchor client delayed renewal, and never once put my name on the business because she said she needed at least one thing that wasn't interpreted as my extension. I respected that. Or told myself I did. The Beaumonts remained Beaumonts, but distance softened them. Henry still referred to my company as a transportation concern in the tone some men reserve for kennel clubs. Celeste still asked after my mother with a level of concern usually associated with exchange students and temporary weather patterns. Amelia still treated money like the air conditioning, a fixed condition of her reality that only became conversation when it stopped arriving precisely on time. But Genevieve was with me. That mattered. When her father made small jokes about my accent flattening in investor meetings, she rolled her eyes. When Celeste asked whether my Louisville staff found it difficult adjusting to client-facing dress expectations, Genevieve squeezed my knee under the table. When Amelia once introduced me at a dinner party as the reason avocados survive hurricanes, Genevieve corrected her gently and later apologized in bed, forehead against my shoulder. Those things felt like loyalty then. Small, maybe. Still loyalty. What I didn't understand yet was that Genevieve's loyalty only held as long as it did not require her to forfeit belonging in the room she came from. That is the hidden tax on marriages built across class and culture. Love may bridge the distance in private, but the old room keeps waiting to see who bends first in public. I bent often without naming it. I wore the dinner jackets Henry preferred at his clubs. I learned which forks mattered to Celeste's friends and which charities could not be spoken of casually because the families behind them considered sincerity gauche. I laughed off 100 comments that would have sounded monstrous if spoken plainly, references to my admirable bluntness, my surprisingly thoughtful palate, the heroic functionality of my field operations, the way I somehow made industrial logistics sound almost civilized. Almost. That word does a lot of work in old families. The first real warning came in year 6 of our marriage, at Thanksgiving in Charleston, when Henry asked whether I had ever considered selling Hayes Regional and moving into something cleaner. Cleaner? I asked. More strategic, he said. Advisory, capital placement, board work. You've made a fine fortune in movement and spoilage control, but at some point men generally prefer the room where decisions are made to the room where boxes are moved. I put my fork down. The boxes are why the decisions matter, I said. Henry smiled over his bourbon. That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes you so entertaining. Entertaining. Genevieve was there. So was Celeste. So was Amelia, already half engaged then to a venture-backed architect from New Orleans that lasted 7 months and 2 magazine shoots. Everyone heard it. Genevieve laughed. Just once. Quickly. Reflexively. Barely enough to register. Then she stopped when she saw my face. She apologized later. Said she had been tired, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that sometimes with her family the easiest way to keep peace was to move around the comment instead of freezing the room. I accepted that. Accepted a lot. Because the marriage, outside those rooms, still had tenderness in it. We had Sunday mornings with coffee and no phones. We had long drives back from Savannah where she'd rest her feet on the dashboard and read donor bios aloud in fake British accents until I almost missed exits laughing. We had plans for children that became quieter after 2 losses we never discussed publicly because grief feels vulgar to families who only recognize emotions once they've been framed elegantly. I do not want to rewrite our marriage as a lie. It wasn't. That's what makes betrayal harder to narrate honestly. If the whole thing had been false, leaving would feel cleaner. The problem is usually that some of it was true enough to keep you investing long after the returns turned imaginary. Amelia met Daniel Ramirez at a legal aid fundraiser in Miami. He came from a family that built things with work, not myth. His father ran a marine electrical business. His mother taught bilingual elementary school for 28 years. Daniel went to the University of Florida, then Columbia Law, then a corporate firm in Miami where he developed a reputation for being precise without being oily, which in that sector counts as sainthood. Amelia liked that he was accomplished. The Beaumonts liked that he was polished. What they didn't understand was that Daniel had enough actual substance not to confuse their approval with elevation. He and I got along from the beginning because he asked direct questions and heard direct answers without performing anthropology on me. At the engagement dinner he noticed Henry described the wedding budget as a sacred family undertaking, and later, while we were standing near the valet, he said quietly, "Your father-in-law talks about money like it's weather." I laughed. That's because he thinks forecasting counts as creating it. Daniel grinned. Good to know I'm not the only one hearing static. I should have paid more attention to that moment. Because 4 months before the wedding, when Henry's capital stack finally cracked and the Beaumonts came to my kitchen asking for a silent rescue, Daniel was the one person outside the family who understood exactly what kind of humiliation they were trying to outsource. He just didn't know yet how far they'd take it. And neither, if I'm honest, did I. The request came on a Thursday night in March, just after 10, with rain crawling down the kitchen windows and Amelia crying at my counter like mascara had been invented specifically to dramatize debt. Genevieve had invited her over without telling me why. That's always the first tell in a marriage sliding toward bad faith. Logistics arrive before truth does. Amelia was wearing cashmere the color of sea foam and speaking in jagged bursts between tears. The venue deposit had gone out. The floral retainer was non-refundable. The custom invitations had been mailed. The band expected its second installment in 2 weeks. Henry had assured everyone liquidity would be in place. Now, suddenly, there was an administrative freeze on part of the family capital structure and nobody could move funds the way they had planned. Administrative freeze. Interesting phrase. I knew enough by then to hear what language was trying to disguise. Administrative freeze in Beaumont dialect meant lenders were asking impolite questions and somebody had counted on time behaving more obediently than it had. Genevieve stood behind Amelia with both hands on her shoulders and looked at me with calm urgency. "It's temporary," she said. "Dad's waiting on a property unwind. He'll be furious if this gets out. You know how people talk in Charleston." "How much?" I asked. Amelia sniffed. "We don't have final totals yet." That answer alone told me the number was already obscene. I said, "How much as of tonight?" Genevieve answered this time. "About 180. Maybe 190 once the rehearsal events are counted." Amelia broke again. "I cannot have my wedding collapse, Caleb. Everyone already has the invitations. Daniel's family has flights booked. Mom says if vendors start gossiping it will be all over town before Sunday brunch." That was the point, of course. Not the marriage. Not Amelia's panic, though that was real enough. Reputation. The preservation of Beaumont continuity. A wedding that stayed expensive long enough for other people to keep believing the money story. Why not scale it back? I asked. Both sisters stared at me as if I had suggested the ceremony be moved to a bass pro shop. Genevieve recovered first. "Because it's too late for that and you know it." "No. I knew it was too late for their preferred version of dignity." "Different thing." Still, I said nothing for a moment. Rain tapped the windows. The dishwasher hummed. Amelia's breathing came in the sharp little pulls of a woman who had reached the first true inconvenience of her adult life and was trying to decide whether grief or outrage would flatter her more. Then Genevieve came around the island and stood beside me. "Please," she said, quiet enough that Amelia couldn't hear the full shape of it. "Just float it. Quietly. Dad repays you when the land position clears. No one has to know. There are requests that are really audits of your role in a family. This was one. Would I act like a son-in-law or a sponsor? Would I protect the family image even if the family itself remains suspicious of me as evidence of lower origins with a capital account? I wish I could tell you I said no. I didn't. I said I'd handle the vendors directly through my office, with non-disclosure language where possible, and that I wanted full visibility into contracts before anything moved. Amelia cried harder, but this time from relief. Genevieve kissed my cheek. She whispered, "Thank you," against my skin in that old intimate way that once made every burden feel briefly chosen. By midnight I had Nina Park, my CFO, looped in with our outside family office counsel and a private events controller recommended by one of our hospitality clients. By morning we knew the actual number was not 180. It was already 246,000, with probable expansion because Amelia treated estimates the way children treat boundaries. Venue, 112. Catering and premium bar, 68. Florals, 31. Wardrobe, not my problem initially, until it somehow became one. Band, rehearsal dinner, transportation, lodging adjustments, custom stationery, live painter, specialty lighting, cigar terrace. Post-wedding brunch. I had built a company by learning to respect costs people call incidental when they expect someone else to absorb them. So I absorbed them carefully. Nina created a discrete event ledger through one of my private entities. Not to hide wrongdoing. To prevent theater. Vendors were told funds would clear from a family office manager on behalf of the bride's household. Some knew better, of course. Anyone in luxury service long enough develops a sixth sense for where real authority sits. But money that arrives on time becomes its own confidentiality agreement. Henry called me that Saturday. Not to thank me. To manage tone. "I understand you're helping stabilize timing," he said. Stabilize timing. That's one way to describe it, I replied. Let's make sure we keep the family dimension of this intact. Amelia doesn't need to feel she's being rescued by an operational intervention. Operational intervention. I leaned back in my office chair and stared at the Louisville yard through the glass, watching forklifts move around late-season produce loads like competence had always been its own language. Henry, with respect, if money leaves my accounts and enters her vendors, that is rescue in any dialect. He exhaled softly, annoyed not by the truth but by the lack of upholstery around it. Words matter. Especially in families. Then choose better ones, I said. There was a pause. Of course we'll make this right. That's another sentence rich men use when repayment has not yet met planning. Celeste handled her side differently. She called me 3 times over the next month with what sounded like gratitude if you tilted your head and lowered your standards. She worried aloud about Amelia's nerves, Daniel's family expectations, the cruelty of public gossip, the burden this all must place on Genevieve. Once she even said, "You're being very generous in ways people may never fully appreciate." May never. Not will never. May never. A tiny verbal hedge placed there like a legal disclaimer. I should have paid attention. The expenses climbed anyway. They always do when people who have never faced consequence discover a solvent relative with emotional investment in household peace. Amelia switched florists because the original peonies photographed too warm. She added a second photographer for black and white candids. She upgraded the welcome bags after seeing another bride's monogrammed silk sleep masks on social media. The rehearsal dinner venue changed twice. The bridesmaid dresses were reordered when Celeste decided dusty blue made one of Henry's donor friend's daughters look jaundiced. Every change came to Genevieve first. Every solution came to me. That was the other slow shift in our marriage. Genevieve no longer argued with her family's assumptions that I would handle fallout. She simply routed them better. Smiled more gently. Reframed their dependence as a compliment to my competence. You do these things faster than they can even think about them, she said once, when I mentioned Amelia's 4th menu revision in 10 days. That's not praise, I told her. She looked honestly confused. Why not? Because competence, once made domestic, becomes expectation. Because the person who fixes everything often wakes up years later to discover he has been downgraded in his own home from partner to infrastructure. But I didn't say all that. Not then. I just said, it starts sounding like a job nobody thanks you for. She kissed my forehead and said, I thank you. Maybe she did. Just not enough to change any behavior built on the assumption. In early May, Nina flagged something odd. A private events consultant connected to the wedding had requested revised proof of funds language and title positioning for the host page in the printed program. The initial file draft listed. Hosted by Mr. and Mrs. Henry Beaumont. Nina asked whether that was intentional. I stared at the PDF on my laptop for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Genevieve with one sentence. Interesting definition of hosted. She called immediately. Caleb, please don't make this a thing. A thing? You know what I mean. Dad's already raw about the situation. The program language is ceremonial, not financial. Ceremonial, not financial. I said, the ceremony seems to rely pretty heavily on the finances. Her voice tightened. Must every kindness become an invoice with you? That one got through. Not because it was true. Because it was unfair in precisely the way unfairness works best, by converting your labor into temperament. I could have reminded her I had never once raised the total. Never once asked Amelia to trim anything. Never once attached my generosity to public recognition. All I wanted was accuracy. Instead I said, leave the host line. She exhaled, relieved. Thank you. There is a very specific loneliness in being thanked for agreeing to your own erasure. The warnings kept coming. 2 weeks later, during a planning call I wasn't supposed to hear because Genevieve had me on speaker while driving. Celeste asked whether it might be wise to position me at a secondary family table so certain older Charleston guests weren't confused about branches. Branches. As if I were not the husband of her elder daughter but an oddly well-dressed cousin from the practical side of the bloodline. Genevieve didn't correct her. She said only, we'll see what the planner can do. I stared at the dashboard while traffic moved around us and something cold began arranging itself in me. What did she mean by branches? I asked after Genevieve ended the call. She kept her eyes on the road. You know how she talks. Yes, I said. That's why I asked what she meant. A beat. Then, she just meant the table politics are complicated. Daniel's senior partners are coming, his grandmother is traditional, and there are family friends who still map Charleston socially by last names. Amelia wants clean optics in the photos. There it was again. Optics. The magic word that turns insult into logistics. Am I in the photos? I asked. Of course you are. As what? She glanced at me then, finally annoyed. Caleb, don't do this. Don't do this. A sentence that, in certain marriages, really means I need you to stay convenient for 1 more week. By June, Henry had still not repaid $1. The Savannah land unwind had become a refinancing discussion, which then became a timing issue with 2 minority partners, which then became, in plain English, a man too leveraged to admit he was no longer directing the weather. I didn't press. Not because I trusted him. Because I had quietly secured myself elsewhere. When you build large operational businesses, you develop habits people call paranoid until those habits save you. Mine included documentation, personal guarantees where appropriate, and the refusal to confuse family emotion with risk management. In exchange for covering the wedding through my private entity, I had required a contingent note against a portion of Henry's marina-adjacent retail parcel outside Mount Pleasant. He signed because he assumed repayment would come before paper mattered. Assumption is expensive. He wasn't the only one making it. The week before the wedding, the final seating chart arrived by email. I wasn't on it. Not omitted entirely. Worse. I was listed under Overflow Family, Table 29. I read it twice. Then I looked at the head table where Genevieve sat beside Amelia and Daniel, Henry and Celeste flanking, Daniel's parents given front row center with the siblings and grandparents. Even Amelia's college roommate had a closer sightline. I sent the screenshot to Genevieve. Her reply came 3 minutes later. It's temporary. Planners moving pieces around for visibility. Please trust me. Trust me. Another sentence that works beautifully right up until the event itself begins and you discover trust was simply the cheapest way to secure your compliance. By the afternoon of the wedding day, I knew exactly where I was seated. At the back. Behind a floral column. Near the service door. And if there was still any part of me hoping someone in that family would look at the final room, the final chart, the final humiliation and say enough, that hope died the moment Celeste called me Daniel. By the time Henry approached my table to lecture me about optics, I was no longer confused. Just quiet. And then Daniel Ramirez crossed the ballroom, stopped beside my chair, and asked the one question no one in the Beaumont family had anticipated hearing out loud. Mr. Hayes, he said again, looking from me to Henry, why are you sitting back here? You can tell a lot about a man's conscience by how quickly he recognizes theft when it isn't financial. Daniel recognized it immediately. For one suspended second, Henry Beaumont looked as if he might pretend not to have heard the question. That is a common reflex in expensive rooms. If acknowledgement threatens the architecture, simply delay it and hope someone more junior supplies a softer subject. But Daniel was standing there in black tuxedo and patent shoes, calm as a man asking for a drink order, and half the surrounding tables had already gone quiet. I set my glass down. Seating revisions, I said. Daniel's eyes moved to the handwritten place card, then to the floral column, then to the service corridor where 2 waiters had frozen mid-step with trays of champagne coupes. This was not an accident, he said. Henry smiled, the public smile now, all varnish. Daniel, don't concern yourself with logistics. We had to accommodate a few family adjustments and some of your firm's senior people at the front. My firm's senior people are at table 12, Daniel said. My mother noticed because she thought it was too close to the band. Henry's face didn't move much, but the air around him did. The difference between truly competent people and merely dominant ones is that competent people update in real time. Dominant people keep pressing on the original script even after the room has changed. I'm sure this can be sorted after dinner, Henry said. Daniel looked at me. Mr. Hayes, did you know you were seated back here? I considered lying. Not for them. For him. Weddings are delicate machines held together by vanity and floral wire. A single hard truth in the wrong moment can turn a bride's memory into collateral damage. And for all my resentment, I did not want to destroy Daniel and Amelia's evening because the Beaumonts had mistaken my patience for absorptive capacity one time too many. So I gave him the gentlest answer available. I knew where the card was when I arrived, I said. Daniel's jaw tightened. He nodded once, like a man filing away confirmation. Then he did something I will respect for the rest of my life. He didn't lower his voice. There's one more reason I'm asking, he said. Because when I thanked Henry for covering the wedding this morning, he told me the family had handled everything internally. Then our venue manager asked where she should send the final overage memorandum and said she'd been coordinating with Hayes Advisory Holdings for 3 months. So I'd like to know why the man who actually paid for my wedding is sitting behind a flower wall. No one breathed. Not figuratively. Truly. The nearest table went motionless so quickly a spoon slipped from somebody's hand and hit china with a bright little note of disaster. Henry turned toward me first, not Daniel. That was telling. Men like him always blame the witness before the fact. You discussed private family arrangements with the venue? He said. No, I replied. They discussed invoices with the payer. That's usually how accounting works. Celeste appeared at Henry's shoulder as if she'd been summoned by the scent of exposed hierarchy. Genevieve was only steps behind her, face composed but too pale now under the ballroom lights. Amelia, at the center of a cluster of bridesmaids near the dance floor, had gone perfectly still. "What is happening?" she asked. Daniel turned to face her. "Apparently," he said, with more restraint than I would have managed in his position, "your brother-in-law paid for this entire wedding and your family seated him at the back." The band, mercifully oblivious until that instant, finished the last measure of a Cole Porter tune and stopped. Silence moved outward from our table in widening rings. Amelia looked at Henry. Then at Celeste. Then at Genevieve. Not at me. That hurt more than I expected. Because even in exposure, the hierarchy held. I remained the last source consulted about my own humiliation. "That's not what happened," Celeste said quickly. "Then what happened?" Daniel asked. No answer. Or rather, too many answers trying to climb over each other at once. "It's a misunderstanding," Genevieve said. "It was temporary," Henry said. "The planner had to move things," Celeste added. Amelia's voice cut through all of it. "Caleb paid for the wedding." Now they looked at me. All of them. 48 dinner guests, 3 servers, a wedding planner near tears, one saxophonist clutching his instrument like he hoped not to be subpoenaed, and the entire Beaumont family waiting to see whether I would save them from the truth they had built this evening to avoid. I stood up. Slowly. Not as performance. As mercy to my own spine. "Yes," I said. "I covered the event after your father's financing froze in March. The arrangement was supposed to stay private to preserve family dignity. I agreed to that. The back table part wasn't discussed with me quite so explicitly." Amelia made a sound like someone had slapped her with paperwork. "Dad?" Henry lifted his chin. "I had every intention of making the family whole when the Savannah position cleared." Daniel laughed once. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just in disbelief. That wasn't the question. Amelia turned to Genevieve then, because sisters often reserve their most violent need for confirmation from each other. "Did you know?" Genevieve hesitated. That was enough. But she answered anyway. "Of course I knew. Caleb and I decided together." "We did not decide together that I'd be seated behind the service door," I said. Her eyes flashed to mine, sharp now. "Not ashamed. Cornered. Can we not do this in front of everyone?" That sentence nearly broke me with its audacity. Not because it was wrong in principle. Because she had found it too late. "You lost the right to privacy when you let the room be arranged this way," I said. Daniel stepped back from the table and looked around the conservatory. "No vows until this is fixed," he said. The planner made a choking sound. Celeste reached for Amelia's wrist. Henry's face finally lost color. "Daniel," he said, dropping the public voice at last, "don't be melodramatic." "Melodramatic?" Daniel repeated. "You let your son-in-law fund this entire wedding, told me you had it covered, and then shoved him behind a pillar so the right people wouldn't ask the wrong questions. If I marry into that without stopping, I become part of it. There are moments when a family discovers, too late, that the outsider at the door has better instincts than the blood at the table. This was one." Amelia looked like she might either faint or set fire to the centerpieces. Her voice came out thin and furious. "Is this true? All of it?" Celeste reached again for euphemism. "Sweetheart, your father had a temporary liquidity problem and Caleb, very kindly, offered." "I did not offer," I said. She stopped. I rarely interrupted older people in that family. They had built entire expectations on that habit. Genevieve asked, I continued. "You all accepted?" I said yes because I didn't want your wedding collapsing around vendor calls and gossip. That's what happened. Amelia's mascara was beginning to fail. She looked at Henry the way children look at adults when they first understand the adult may not actually be in charge of reality. "You said everything was handled." "It was handled," Henry snapped, then hurt himself and adjusted too late. By family. Daniel's expression hardened. Then why is Caleb not seated as family? No one answered. Because there was no answer that survived daylight. Around us, the room had split into camps of discomfort. Some guests were pretending not to hear while clearly hearing every syllable. Some were openly fascinated. Daniel's mother had both hands pressed over her mouth, not from horror but from the kind of moral recognition certain women from working families feel when they watch status people humiliate the wrong person publicly and discover the wrong person knows how to stay upright. Henry made one final attempt at command. This is neither the time nor the place. Amelia is already emotional, the ceremony needs to begin, and there are guests here who deserve better than this sideshow. I almost admired the move. Reframe the exposure as the offense. Classic. But Daniel was done with him. He looked at the planner and said, "Move Caleb to the family row. Now. And if there's no seat, remove mine until there is." That landed harder than anything else because it wasn't rhetorical. It was logistical. Real. The planner moved instantly, not because she suddenly developed courage, but because weddings are fundamentally governed by whoever seems most likely to sign or void the final release. Celeste whispered, "Daniel, please." He turned to her politely. "Mrs. Beaumont, with respect, if I let this slide because the flowers are expensive and the photos are already scheduled, then you and I mean very different things when we use the word family." Genevieve stepped closer to me then, low voice, teeth barely moving. "Just let them reseat you and stop," she said. "Do not turn this into some class war." I looked at her. Really looked. At the woman who had once kissed my knuckles in a hotel parking garage outside Savannah because she said I made her feel safe. At the woman who had asked me to save her sister's wedding because she knew I could. At the woman now standing in a room built on my money and telling me not to embarrass people who had already decided embarrassment was my job to absorb. "I didn't start the war," I said quietly. "I just refused the assigned uniform." Her face changed then. A flicker. Small. Defensive. Wounded not by the insult itself but by my refusal to keep carrying it quietly. The planner returned with 2 assistants and a reshaped seating chart. Table 1 expanded. One donor couple moved graciously, or at least expensively. A new chair appeared in the front family section. I didn't move. Henry noticed. There. Problem solved. "No," Daniel said. "Not solved. Corrected under pressure. Very different thing." He turned to me. "Will you sit with the family?" It was a fair question. And one I understood had very little to do with chairs. The entire conservatory was waiting to see whether I would accept the repaired position and thereby allow everyone to pretend the original insult had been a misunderstanding rather than a revelation. I could feel Nina's words from earlier pressing at the edge of my thoughts. "Please tell me someone in that family at least put you near the front." I looked at the front row. The polished place cards. The adjusted smiles. The emergency seat made from exposure rather than respect. Then I looked back at Daniel. "I'll sit where you want me," I said. "But don't mistake my cooperation for confusion." He gave one solemn nod. Understood. So I walked with him. Past the floral wall. Past the tables that had suddenly discovered intense interest in their bread plates. Past Henry and Celeste standing side by side like expensive furniture after a house fire. When I reached the front family section, Daniel held the chair for me himself. Not as a servant's gesture. As a statement. Then he stepped back to the altar. And before the officiant could restart the ceremony script, Daniel faced the room and said, "Before we continue, I want to thank Caleb Hayes for making sure this wedding happened at all. I was not given accurate information earlier, and I don't intend to begin my marriage with a lie sitting in the front row pretending to be etiquette." That sentence will probably outlive all their centerpieces. Amelia started crying then, for real this time. Not bridal tears. Not nerves. The ugly, destabilizing kind that come when your own celebration suddenly reflects the family pattern you'd spent years insisting was just refinement. The ceremony resumed anyway, because life is grotesque and beautiful in equal measure and vows can still be sincere even when the room around them is morally under renovation. I sat in the front row. I stood when the others stood. I watched Amelia and Daniel promise each other forever while Henry stared straight ahead like posture could still broker reality. And through all of it, Genevieve never looked at me. Not once. That told me more than the back table ever had. Humiliation arranged by family is one thing. Abandonment by the person who asked for your sacrifice is another. By the time the officiant pronounced them married and the band, trembling with the survival instincts of underpaid artists, launched into something triumphant, I knew the wedding wasn't the only thing ending that night. The Beaumonts just didn't know it yet. If you've never watched a ballroom attempt to metabolize public truth while still serving filet mignon on schedule, it is one of the more educational spectacles wealth can buy. The ceremony ended to applause that sounded half sincere and half administrative. People cried, hugged, took photographs, and recalibrated their internal narratives in real time. The servers resumed movement with the speed of soldiers returning to a battlefield after a weather delay. Someone dimmed the lights for the first dance. Someone else uncorked another line of champagne as if bubbles could soften class exposure into anecdote. I remained at the front table because Daniel had put me there and because moving myself back would have been a form of permission neither I nor he was interested in granting. Henry and Celeste sat 2 seats away speaking to each other in low, clipped fragments that never reached the level of language. Amelia danced with Daniel through one verse of a jazz standard and spent the next verse with her smile fixed too tightly to survive close photography. Genevieve drifted between bridesmaids, her mother, and the planner with the contained precision of a woman trying to keep 50 glass objects from admitting they were already broken. I sat still. Stillness is underrated. People mistake it for passivity because they cannot imagine a mind remaining active without also needing to fill the air. Mine was very active. I was revising the last 4 months in light of the one fact that could no longer be hidden from me: Genevieve had not merely tolerated my marginalization. She had cooperated with it. That changes everything. Around 8:40, as the band moved into a Sinatra set and the first wave of donor men loosened ties in what they believed passed for authentic revelry, my phone buzzed. Nina. How bad? I looked toward the dance floor where Celeste was smiling for photos with the mother of the bride posture she'd spent 20 years perfecting, and typed back. Bad enough that the groom fixed the seating chart himself. Her reply came instantly. I need the story later. Also, reminder, Henry's contingent note matures Monday if not cured. There it was. Not revenge. Sequence. That note against the Mount Pleasant parcel had not been theatrical when I required it. It had been ordinary prudence, the kind of prudence families like the Beaumonts call ungenerous when it appears too close to their own emotional needs. Henry had signed because he assumed his financing issues would resolve well before paper developed teeth. They hadn't. And now the same room that had attempted to hide me had watched Daniel Ramirez publicly attach my name to the evening's existence. Optics, I thought. Those must be difficult now. Genevieve finally approached me during the salad course. She sat without asking, which was the most marital thing she'd done in hours, and kept her eyes on the dance floor. Are you happy? She asked. No preamble. No apology. Just accusation dressed as a temperature check. No, I said. That startled her enough that she turned. Then what exactly was the point of all that? I almost smiled. All that. As if Daniel's question, my answer. And the truth itself had conspired spontaneously from the floral arrangements. There wasn't a point, I said. There was a consequence. She shook her head once, small and furious. You could have lied. To save who? Amelia. Amelia was never the target. You don't know what this did to her. I looked at my sister-in-law across the room accepting congratulations from guests who now knew her father couldn't pay for the wedding he had spent a year narrating his legacy. I know exactly what it did to her, I said. It introduced reality during cocktail hour. Genevieve's mouth tightened. You're being cruel. No. Cruel was asking me to cover the wedding and then helping your family bury me behind a flower wall. That hit. Not because she hadn't heard it before. Because she'd heard it from me plainly. She lowered her voice. You are making this uglier than it had to be. Interesting, I said. I was under the impression the ugly part was done the moment you let your mother misname me at my own funded table and said nothing. A little color rose in her cheeks. That was a mistake. No, I said. That was a reveal. People talk about the turning point in a marriage as if it's always one moment. An affair. A slap. A signature. More often it's the instant one spouse finally names a pattern the other has relied on remaining atmospherically deniable. This was ours. Genevieve leaned closer. My family was under pressure, she said. Dad is trying to unwind multiple positions, Amelia was falling apart, the guest list had political dimensions you don't fully appreciate, and yes, maybe some people made terrible calls tonight, but you can't pretend your pride wasn't waiting for a stage. That almost impressed me. The precision of it. The way she had translated my dignity into appetite, as if refusal to be erased were just a rural man's vanity reaching for chandeliers. My pride? I repeated. Yes. I held her gaze. Genevieve, I covered a $300,000 wedding quietly for a family that can barely bring itself to call what I do by its proper name. If pride were my operating problem, we'd never have made it past the first florist revision. She looked away first. That mattered. Not for victory. For clarity. At 9:15, just after Daniel and Amelia cut the cake with all the grim coordination of attractive people performing resilience for a photographer, Henry requested a private word. We went out to the east terrace where the estate fountain hummed under string lights and smokers were pretending not to smoke near the garden wall. Henry waited until the nearest guests had drifted away before speaking. You made your point, he said. Did I? Whatever satisfaction this gave you, let's not compound the damage. Amelia's marriage should not begin under this kind of cloud. I looked at him in the soft terrace light, at the man who had spent decades converting entitlement into credibility through perfect collars and minimal verbs. What damage are you referring to exactly? I asked. The truth? Or the seating arrangement that made the truth necessary? His jaw flexed once. You enjoy cornering language. No, I said. I enjoy when language stops being allowed to escape consequences. He exhaled slowly. What do you want? There it was. The old assumption. That every boundary conceals a purchase order. Tonight? I asked. Nothing. The wedding already told me what I needed to know. If this is about repayment, the Mount Pleasant parcel cures Monday. You have my word. I actually laughed then. Not because it was funny. Because hearing a man like Henry Beaumont offer word in place of cleared funds after the week we'd had felt almost artistic. Your word is what got us the flower wall, I said. He took one step closer. Don't get sanctimonious. You benefited from this family too. Connections, access, legitimacy and rooms money alone doesn't buy. That one was worth hearing because it was the first fully honest thing he'd said to me in years. Not true in the broad sense. My business had never depended on Beaumont grace. But true in the sense that Henry believed legitimacy was his to allocate, and therefore anyone receiving his proximity ought to remain proportionately grateful regardless of who was financing the furniture. Let's say you're right, I said. Let's say I got access. If that's the exchange rate, why was I seated next to the service corridor? He said nothing. The fountain kept running. From inside the ballroom came the muffled sound of applause as Amelia tossed the bouquet, an ancient ritual by which women in silk are encouraged to perform scarcity for sport. Henry spoke again without looking at me. "Genevieve loves you." That landed differently than he intended. Because I believed it. Or at least I believed she had. The problem was not love's total absence. The problem was its repeated surrender whenever belonging demanded tribute. "Maybe," I said. "But not enough to stand where it costs her something." He frowned. "Marriage requires flexibility." "Not that much." I left him on the terrace. Back inside, Daniel intercepted me near the bar. He had removed his jacket and rolled his sleeves one turn, which on most men would have looked sloppy and on him looked like moral clarity with cuff links. "You okay?" he asked. That's a simple question. In certain rooms, it's also a declaration of allegiance. "I'm fine," I said. "I doubt that." "That's fair." He glanced toward Amelia, who was now smiling for photographs with 2 elderly cousins and 1 woman from Charleston society who had certainly already texted 3 friends about the ceremony delay. "I didn't mean to blow up the room," he said. "You didn't. The room had structural issues before you walked in." That got the quickest ghost of a grin from him. Then he lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, I had my suspicions before tonight. Venue people kept asking questions that didn't match Henry's story. Your wife corrected a caterer earlier when he tried to thank her father for the wine upgrade and said only, 'Everything's under control.' People who are telling the truth usually speak more directly than that." "Interesting." I let that file away quietly. "You handled it with more dignity than I probably would have," he said. "I handled it with witnesses," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He nodded once. He understood. Then, because the universe has a vulgar sense of timing, Amelia approached us. Her makeup had been professionally repaired, which is to say she looked flawless if you ignored the human being underneath. She took Daniel's arm, then looked at me with an expression somewhere between gratitude and accusation. "I wish you'd told me," she said. "A lesser man might have enjoyed what came next more than I did." Not because Amelia deserved gentleness. She had stood on the benefits of my money while her family tried to store me out of frame. But because weddings are already cruel enough to the bride without turning every answer into a blade. So I gave her the cleanest truth available. "It wasn't my place to expose your father in the middle of your engagement," I said. "I thought the decent thing was to keep the event standing and let your family handle the rest honestly." Her eyes filled again, fast this time. "They said it was temporary." "It was temporary," I said. "Until it wasn't." That made Daniel squeeze her hand. She looked between us and for the first time in the decade I'd known her, Amelia seemed to register that her family name did not automatically make her the primary injured party in every room. That realization is painful. Good. But painful. Later, close to 11, after the speeches had been shortened and the donors sufficiently relubricated with open bar mercy, I slipped out to take a call from Nina. She got straight to it. "I heard from counsel," she said. "Do you want the note action prepared if Monday doesn't cure?" "Prepare it," I said. "Personal or through outside?" "Outside. Keep it clean." A beat. Then, because Nina had known me long enough to hear what wasn't being said, "You doing this because of tonight?" "No," I said. Tonight just confirmed they expected leniency where they had offered none. That's what I thought. I ended the call and stood under the terrace lights for a minute, letting the night air strip perfume and brass from my lungs. Somewhere behind me the band had started a louder set. Laughter rose and broke against the estate walls. The wedding would continue, as weddings do, because no amount of moral discomfort has ever been enough to outbid deposits already sunk into entertainment. When I went back inside, Genevieve was waiting near the side corridor. Not with tears. That would have been easier. With fury. "Did you just call your finance people during my sister's wedding?" she asked. My finance people have been involved in your sister's wedding for months. You know what I mean. Yes, I said. Do you? She crossed her arms. If you do anything punitive to my father right now, I swear to God, Caleb. What? She stared at me. Sometimes the most revealing moment in a marriage is not the insult. It's the blank space after the threat, when one spouse realizes the old leverage no longer has a room to stand in. Don't make this uglier, she said finally. Then stop asking me to keep paying for beautiful versions of it. Her eyes went hard. Maybe my family was right about one thing, she said. Maybe you do like being the man with the key when everyone else is trapped outside. That one deserved an answer. No, I said. I just know what it costs to build the door. And that was the last real conversation we had as husband and wife. At midnight, while Amelia and Daniel drove away under sparklers and orchestrated sentiment, I sat alone in the back seat of a town car paid for by my own account and understood with total calm that some endings do not arrive when love disappears. They arrive when respect does. The wedding had made that visible. Monday would make it expensive. Monday morning began with weather bright enough to insult the previous 48 hours. Charlotte was all clean blue sky and commuter traffic behaving as if no one anywhere had ever been seated behind a flower wall by people wearing my money in formal clothes. I was in the office by 7:10. Hayes Regional occupied 4 floors in a glass building south of Uptown, all brushed steel, operational dashboards. And conference rooms named after rivers because one of our early branding consultants believed infrastructure men liked metaphor if it was geographic enough. I normally loved Mondays. Movement, numbers, clean priorities, the satisfying honesty of systems revealing their stress before sentiment had time to intervene. That Monday, honesty had a very specific address. At 7:22, Nina walked into my office with a black folder and a coffee large enough to qualify as an act of respect. Mount Pleasant note didn't cure by 7 a.m., she said. Counsel's ready. I opened the folder. Henry Beaumont had until close of business Friday to clear the contingent note against the retail parcel. He hadn't. That meant default procedures could begin. Not foreclosure in the vulgar movie sense. Just notice, acceleration options, and the kind of legal sunlight men like Henry spend their entire lives avoiding because it makes their private improvisations sound too much like math. Any movement over the weekend? I asked. 3 calls from his office Saturday. 2 Sunday. 1 from an attorney at 6:40 this morning asking for courtesy extension. Courtesy. Interesting word in the mouth of a family that had seated me near the service door. Did counsel respond? Said we'd review internally. I looked out over the city for a moment. This is the part people romanticize incorrectly. They imagine revenge feels hot. Triumphant. It doesn't, at least not when you are old enough to understand that every ugly correction leaves residue on the person making it. What I felt was colder. Less vengeance than filtration. The wedding had not created a debt. The debt already existed. The wedding had simply eliminated the last emotional argument for pretending paper shouldn't matter because family was involved. Send the notice, I said. Nina nodded like she'd expected nothing else. Anything else? Yes. Move my personal scheduling off the shared household calendar. Effective now. And ask Mara Ellison whether she's free before lunch. Mara was not my divorce lawyer yet. She was outside family counsel, discreet and devastatingly precise, the kind of attorney who preferred structure to theater and therefore won more than louder people understood. By 8:15 she was in my office wearing a navy suit and carrying 1 legal pad, which meant she already suspected the marriage itself had crossed from strain into governance. I told her everything in order. The funding. The seating chart. Daniel's public correction. Genevieve's response. Henry's terrace conversation. The note. Mara listened without interruption except to pin dates to specifics. When I finished, she tapped her pen once against the pad. Do you want the legal question or the personal one? She asked. Both. Legally, your note action is clean if not retaliatory in documentation or timing. It predates the wedding, has objective default terms, and should be handled through counsel only. Personally, your marriage is now a live liability environment. Shared accounts, shared access, shared narrative exposure. If your wife is still aligning outwardly with her family against your interests, you need to decide whether you're managing a relationship or a perimeter. That sentence deserved its own frame. Managing a relationship or a perimeter. I said, what would you do? She gave me the lawyer's answer first. I would separate logistics before emotion gets the chance to rewrite them. Cards, passwords, property inventories, discretionary transfers, entity access. Quietly. Not punitively. Precisely. Then the human answer. And I would ask myself whether the person at the center of all this is upset that you were humiliated or upset that the humiliation failed to stay private. I didn't answer because I didn't have to. At 9:03 Genevieve called. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. Her voice was steady in the way voices get steady when the speaker has spent the morning converting feeling into argument. We need to talk before you do anything rash with my father, she said. You are taking one terrible social mistake and turning it into a financial bloodbath. Call me back. One terrible social mistake. There it was. Reduced, sanitized, ironed flat. Not a pattern. Not a revelation. Not a marriage wound exposing its own foundation. A social mistake. I forwarded the voicemail to Mara. She replied 2 minutes later. Do not return directly. If you want space, say so through counsel or in writing only. By 10:30 Henry's attorney had finally sent a formal extension request full of high-end desperation disguised as mutual professionalism. They cited temporary liquidity constraints, long-standing family relationship, and a desire to avoid unnecessary escalation. No admission. No gratitude. Certainly no mention that his daughter had arranged my social disappearance 48 hours earlier while drinking champagne purchased on my ledger. I denied the extension. Not with a flourish. With a signed response from counsel and a calm explanation that the note had matured uncured in our office would be proceeding according to contract. At 11:12, Genevieve arrived. Not at the house. My office. Reception called up first, as trained. I considered refusing her. Then I remembered something my mother once told me after a neighbor's ugly divorce when I was 16, if a person insists on choosing the scene, at least make sure it's one with fluorescent lights and witnesses. So I told reception to send her in. Genevieve entered carrying fury like it had been steamed for the drive. She was still beautiful. That was part of the problem. Beauty makes people overestimate the decency of the structures built around it. Cream blouse, tan trousers, hair tied back, sunglasses still in one hand like she'd arrived from a lunch where none of this belonged to her. She closed the office door and stood without sitting. Tell me you didn't just call my father's note, she said. I didn't call anything, I said. Counsel sent notice on a matured default. Caleb. Genevieve. That made her inhale sharply. We had never weaponized first names before. Married people don't realize how intimate tone allocation becomes until they withdraw it. You are doing this because of the wedding, she said. I'm doing this because your father failed to cure a debt and spent the weekend acting offended by evidence. She took 2 steps toward my desk. You know perfectly well he would have solved it with a little time. Then he should have purchased some instead of centerpieces. She stared at me. I stared back. There are times in a marriage when one spouse finally discovers the other has stopped translating. The language does not soften. It simply lands. I came here to stop you from making a permanent decision out of humiliation, she said. Too late. The permanent decision was letting your family teach me exactly where I rank when the room matters. Monday is just paperwork. That landed hard enough that she sat without deciding to. The chair caught her under the knees and suddenly she looked tired in a way the wedding had not permitted. "It was one table," she said. "No anger now. Just plea." And because honesty has no mercy once it starts, I answered her exactly. "No. It was one marriage. The table just made it visible." She looked down at her hands. "I asked you to help because I thought you were stronger than them." "I was. That's why they used me." "That's not fair." "Neither was the place card." She closed her eyes for a moment. "I was trying to keep everything from collapsing at once. Including me. Preferably quietly." "You always do this." "Do what?" "You turn every emotional injury into a structural verdict." I almost laughed because of course I did. That's what happens when you're raised by people who know roofs cave in long before they fall all the way through. You learn to take cracks seriously. "Maybe," I said. "But tell me where I'm wrong." She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Then chose honesty by accident. "I couldn't embarrass my parents in front of everyone," she said. There it was. Bare. Simple. True. Not "I didn't mean to hurt you." Not "I froze." Not "I thought it would be fixed before it mattered." I couldn't embarrass my parents in front of everyone. Meaning she could let them embarrass me. That was acceptable collateral. That was survivable in her moral math. I felt something inside me settle fully then. Not break. Settle. Like a beam lowering into its final bracket. "Thank you," I said. She frowned. "For what?" "For finally saying it plainly." Her eyes widened a fraction. "Caleb, don't do that. Don't act like one sentence defines 9 years. It doesn't define them," I said. "It explains them." We were quiet after that. The city moved outside my windows. Phones rang in the outer office. A forklift acquisition briefing waited in the next conference room. All of it absurdly normal. Genevieve stood. "So what now?" she asked. I had thought about that before she arrived. Mara had helped. So had the flower wall. "Now we separate logistics," I said. "You keep your consultancy. Your personal accounts remain yours. Household staff transition through my office until the inventory is complete. Shared discretionary cards shut off Friday. You'll have use of the Myers Park apartment for 60 days if you want it. After that, council handles everything else." For the first time since she'd walked in, fear replaced anger. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Over this?" "Because of what this revealed." Her voice dropped. "You're leaving me." I considered correcting the grammar. "No. We are ending." "No. You already stepped out, I'm just refusing to stand in the old outline." But cruelty in grammar rarely improves reality. So I said only, "I'm done protecting rooms that ask me to disappear for them." That made her cry. Not dramatically. No collapse. No movie scene. Just tears she seemed almost annoyed by, which in Genevieve had always been the clearest sign something real had reached her. "I loved you," she said. Past tense. Interesting. Maybe accidental. Maybe not. "I know," I said. "I loved you too. That's why I paid for the wedding." She flinched at that. Good. Not because I wanted pain. Because some truths deserve full contact with the person who benefited from avoiding them. She left 15 minutes later with sunglasses back on and posture restored enough for the elevator camera. Mara took over before lunch. By mid-afternoon the household perimeter was being redrawn quietly. Access lists. Property inventories. Insurance notifications. Calendar segregation. Driver credentials. The administrative anatomy of an ending. At 4:50 p.m., Daniel Ramirez called. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. I heard things escalated, he said. News moves fast when rich families discover their bankers talk to lawyers who talk to golf partners who talk to everyone's wives. They clarified, I said. He was quiet a moment. Amelia's been crying all day. At first because she was humiliated. Now because she's realizing what exactly humiliated her. That's progress, I think. Maybe. For whatever it's worth, my mother says the wrong person got shamed at that wedding, but maybe not for the wrong reason. I smiled despite myself. His mother had excellent instincts. She sounds smart, I said. She is. She also wants to feed you and tell you your in-laws were raised by decorative wolves. That actually made me laugh. Daniel let it sit a second. Then he said, softer, I'm sorry, Caleb. That mattered. Not because it fixed anything. Because clean apologies are so rare in rooms where everyone prefers optics to memory. Thank you, I said. After we hung up, I stayed in the office until 7:30 reviewing distribution risk reports and pretending concentration could be summoned by fluorescent lighting alone. Eventually I drove home to a house that still technically held 2 people and felt, for the first time in years, exactly like a negotiation room after signatures had gone dry. Genevieve had taken an overnight bag. Left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter. And moved the framed black and white photograph from our hall table, the one from Florence where we were 20 pounds lighter and still naive enough to think mutual desire could out-negotiate inherited reflex, to face down. That detail, more than the ring, told me she understood the marriage as image before artifact. I didn't turn the photo back up. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, sat at the kitchen island where Amelia had cried me into financing her fantasy, and let the house tell the truth. It was over. Maybe not legally yet. Maybe not publicly yet. But functionally, morally, structurally. Over. And by the end of that week, the wedding that was supposed to have displayed Beaumont grace had instead triggered a property default. A family fracture, and the beginning of my divorce. All because the groom knew my name. And unlike the rest of them, he understood what that name had been carrying. Divorce, when it is handled by adults with expensive lawyers and only moderate appetite for mutual annihilation, is mostly a matter of documentation catching up to what the body already knows. Genevieve moved into the Myers Park apartment for 6 weeks, then into a rental townhouse nearer her office. We divided accounts according to ownership rather than mythology. Her consultancy remained hers, I never wanted it otherwise. The house sold the following spring. The Florence photograph vanished into a banker box somewhere between temporary storage and permanent revision. Mara handled most contact. Blake Turner, the litigator she brought in once it became clear Genevieve's family still believed charm might produce concessions contract structure had already denied, handled the rest. There was no screaming. No plate throwing. No midnight pleas on the lawn. Just the slow humiliation of 2 intelligent people discovering that affection, once separated from respect, can only negotiate with itself for so long before the paper starts to sound more honest. Henry Beaumont cured the Mount Pleasant default eventually, but only after selling a minority parcel at a discount he described to everyone as strategic portfolio simplification. The wedding story circulated through Charleston the way stories always do there, not as fact, exactly, but as polished cautionary folklore. Some versions said I had shut down the reception. False. Some said Daniel had refused to marry Amelia until a public apology was made. Not quite, though morally accurate. Some said the Beaumont family had secretly been bankrupt, which was vulgar overreach. They weren't broke. They were merely less solvent than their self-image required. Which, in the circles they preferred, is its own form of poverty. Amelia surprised me. Not immediately. For the first month after the wedding she sent 2 defensive texts through Genevieve, one non-apology about misunderstanding pressure, and then silence. But 6 months later, after Daniel and she had settled into Miami and distance had stripped some of Charleston's performative air from her bloodstream, she called me herself. I almost didn't answer. Then I remembered Daniel's face at the back table. So I did. "Hi," she said, and already I could hear the difference. Less lacquer. More person. "Hi, Amelia." A breath. "I owe you an apology that should have been made without choreography." I said nothing. Letting people walk toward their own accountability is one of the kindest things you can do if you actually want the accountability and not the spectacle. She continued. "I spent most of my life thinking generosity was just something the room naturally produced. Beautiful table, full bar, scholarships, checks, houses, rescue. I didn't understand that somebody was always paying, and I really didn't understand what it means to pretend not to see the person paying when noticing them would complicate the story. That was better than I expected." "Daniel helped with the noticing," I said. She laughed once, embarrassed. "Relentlessly. Also his mother. She has very strong opinions about my family." "I can imagine." Another pause. "I'm sorry," Amelia said. "For the wedding. For not asking harder questions. For letting everything be arranged in a way that made your role invisible because invisible was easier for everybody who still wanted to feel elegant. There are apologies you accept because they are useful and apologies you accept because they are accurate. Hers was the second kind." "Thank you," I said. "You don't have to forgive me." "I probably already do," I answered. "You were raised inside the weather. Most people need distance to realize they've been calling humidity normal." She laughed harder at that, then cried a little, which somehow made her sound more adult than she ever had during our entire decade as family. We spoke for 20 minutes. Mostly about Daniel, Miami, and how absurd it was that her marriage began with her husband dragging her family into moral daylight before the first dance. Before we hung up she said something that stayed with me. "I think you were the first person who ever loved our family without being afraid of us." We confused that with availability. That was close enough to wisdom that I wrote it down afterward. Genevieve and I saw each other only twice in person before the divorce finalized. The first was at mediation, where she wore cream again and looked collected in the way some women do when self-command has become the only inheritance they still trust. We discussed numbers, transitional timing, and the disposition of art neither of us had ever truly liked but had acquired because a donor dinner made it seem grown-up. She was polite. So was I. At one point she asked whether I wanted the antique silver her grandmother had given us. I said no. Not out of bitterness. Because I was tired of keeping objects that arrived with conditions disguised as history. The second time was nearly a year later at the opening of a workforce training center in Jacksonville partly funded through the Hayes Apprenticeship Initiative. She wasn't invited exactly. Her consultancy had advised on donor language for one of the philanthropic partners, and so there she was in the reception line between a museum board chair and a man who sold municipal software with the zeal of a televangelist. We recognized each other at the same instant. Time does strange things to former intimacy. It shrinks some people into memory and enlarges others into meaning. Genevieve did neither. She simply became specific. Not my wife. Not my wound. A woman I had once loved who had chosen belonging over bravery at a decisive hour and then paid for the choice in the ordinary currency of regret. She approached during the dessert coffee service while a state senator was misusing the word infrastructure into a microphone. "Caleb," she said. "Genevieve." There was no cinematic pause. Just recognition. She looked older, which is to say more real. Less curated around the eyes. More thoughtful around the mouth. Her beauty hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply lost the expensive insulation that once made it look untouchable. "I read about the Toledo expansion," she said. "Your father would have loved that." That almost undid me. Not because of nostalgia for us. Because my father had been dead 4 years by then and I still wanted his approval on certain sentences more than I wanted 100 donors standing under branded banners calling my work visionary. I think so, I said. She nodded. Then, after a moment, can I say something without you assuming it's self-serving? I considered that. You can say it, I told her. I'll make my own determination. One corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. Recognition. Fair. She held her cup with both hands as if steadiness required props now. I have replayed that wedding more times than I want to admit, she said. Not the public part. The small part before. My mother calling you the wrong name. My father talking about optics. Me seeing all of it and choosing the room anyway. That's the part that keeps returning. I listened. She went on. I told myself for a long time that I froze because everything was happening at once and I was trying to protect Amelia. But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is uglier. I knew what correcting them in the moment would cost me with my family, and I decided you were strong enough to absorb what I didn't want to confront. There are very few gifts left between ex-spouses that matter. Accurate language is one. I let that settle between us. Then I asked the only question that had mattered for months. Do you understand why that ended us? She didn't flinch. Yes, she said. Because it wasn't about one table. It was about where I asked you to stand every time those worlds touched. And where was that? Her eyes met mine. Wherever it kept the room smooth. Exactly. That was the sentence. Simple. Brutal. True. We stood in silence for a few seconds while the senator mispronounced a county name and people applauded anyway. Then Genevieve said the thing I think she had come to say. I'm sorry, Caleb. Not in the broad, polished way people apologize when they want some part of themselves left intact. I am specifically sorry that I let your generosity become social camouflage. I am sorry I asked you to fund a celebration and then behaved as if your dignity were the negotiable line item. And I am sorry I did it while telling myself I still loved you, as if love counted without courage. That was as good an apology as I was ever going to receive. Maybe as good as anyone gets. I did not hug her. Did not tell her it was all okay. Repair and absolution are cousins, not twins. Thank you, I said. Her eyes shone briefly. Are you happy? This time the question wasn't a weapon. Just human. I thought about my life then. About the apprenticeship initiative in my father's name. About the Louisville hub expansion. About the new place outside Charlotte I had bought with a giant ugly porch and no antique silver in it at all. About my mother visiting and claiming the guest room as if she were inspecting the moral square footage. About Friday nights with no coded tension, no donor dinner politics, no one asking me to finance elegance while pretending it came from elsewhere. Yes, I said. More than I was. She nodded like she had expected that and deserved it to be true. Good, she said. Then she surprised me. For what it's worth, Daniel still talks about that night like it saved him 2 decades of future confusion. I laughed, genuinely. He's a good man. He is, she said. Amelia got lucky. Eventually. Eventually. That's the word for so many adult salvations. We said goodbye after that. No drama. No backward look. Just 2 people standing in a room built to celebrate public virtue, finally speaking without upholstery. When I got back to my hotel that night I stood at the window for a while watching traffic move over the river and thought about how close I had once come to spending the rest of my life mistaking usefulness for belonging. That is a dangerous confusion. Especially for men raised to measure love by what they can carry. If this story lands anywhere personal for you, let me say the part that took me the longest to learn. Generosity is not the same as consent to be diminished. Paying does not obligate you to disappear. And love, if it keeps asking you to absorb public insults so other people can preserve private mythology. is not asking for patience. It's asking for your outline. Do not hand that over. You can be kind without becoming scenery. You can help without volunteering to be hidden. And if a room ever arranges itself to make your dignity negotiable while still relying on your labor, your money, or your steadiness, believe the arrangement the first time. Do not wait for dessert. For me, the lesson came at a wedding under glass and magnolia branches, in a ballroom lit by candles I paid for and surrounded by people who thought the back table would solve their discomfort with dependence. It didn't. Because the groom knew my name. And more important, he knew what names are for. They're not just labels for place cards. They're records. Wait. The shape of who carried what when everyone else preferred the flowers. I kept one thing from that wedding. Not the program. Not the invoice ledger. Not the photograph a gossip site eventually ran of Daniel leading me past the floral column toward the front row. Though Mara did print that one and leave it on my desk with the note, optics updated. What I kept was smaller. A handwritten thank you card from Daniel's mother 6 weeks after the ceremony. Cream paper. Blue ink. Very little decoration. It said, a family should know the name of the man who shows up when the lights are already rented. That sentence still sits in my office. Framed. Not because I need the validation anymore. Because I like reminders that decency often arrives from the people a room is least prepared to hear it from. And because on the day they tried to place me out of sight, one decent man looked up, saw the architecture of the insult, and said my name out loud. Sometimes that's all it takes to bring the whole room back into focus. End of script. Final script word count, 14,805 words.